They say that immortals don't dream, that centuries of existence hollow out the capacity for wonder, leaving only hunger and habit in their wake. I used to believe that. I used to think that monsters were born in darkness, spawned from some ancient curse that stripped away everything human and left only the predator beneath. I was wrong about so many things. My name is Seraphine Thorne, and this is the story of how I saved a vampire's soul and lost my own heart in the process. This is the story of the Crimson, of blood and betrayal, of ancient tongues and deadly secrets. This is the story of how I learned that monsters aren't always the ones with fangs. But most importantly, this is the story of Elias Draven, the last descendant of a bloodline older than the city itself, and how he taught me that redemption isn't found in the light. It's forged in the shadows between damnation and salvation. The first time I saw Elias Draven, he was drinking blood from a crystal goblet with the casual elegance of someone sipping vintage wine at a five-star restaurant, which, in a way, he was. The Crimson wasn't just any restaurant. Nestled in the heart of Lismare's Gothic quarter, it existed in that twilight space between myth and reality that the city seemed to specialize in. By day, it served overpriced fusion cuisine to tourists who wanted to feel dangerous. By night, it became something else entirely, something darker, something true. I'd been working there for 6 months when he first walked into my section. 6 months of serving blood wine to creatures who smiled with too many teeth, of pretending I didn't hear the whispered conversations in languages that predated modern civilization, of walking the razor's edge between fascination and terror. My grandmother had been a hunter, not the kind with rifles and camouflage, but the kind with silver stakes and ancient prayers. She died when I was 12, throat torn out by something that was never caught, never named. My mother forbade me from following in her footsteps, but she couldn't stop me from learning, from studying, from understanding the languages and customs of the creatures that walked Lismare's streets after dark. Old Lyson, the dialect of the ancient bloodlines, had been my obsession for years. My grandmother's journals contained fragments of it, phonetic approximations that I'd practiced until my tongue could wrap around the guttural consonants and liquid vowels. I'd never met anyone who actually spoke it. Until that night, Elias Draven sat in the corner booth with the kind of stillness that only comes from centuries of practice. He was beautiful in the way that dangerous things often are. Sharp cheekbones, dark hair that fell just past his collar, and eyes the color of smoke. He wore his wealth casually, like someone who'd forgotten what it meant to want for anything. He ordered the Chateau Sangre, vintage 1847. I brought it to him in our finest crystal, the liquid inside deep red and slightly warm, exactly as he'd requested. When I set it down, his fingers brushed mine for just a moment. His skin was cool, not cold the way movies always showed vampires, but cool like marble on a spring morning. He looked up at me then, really looked at me, and I felt something shift in the air between us. His eyes held a weariness that had nothing to do with physical exhaustion, and everything to do with time itself. He thanked me in a voice like aged whiskey, smooth and dark and intoxicating, and I, like a fool, smiled back. That's when his fiancée arrived. Lilith Vorienne swept into the Crimson like winter itself had taken human form. She was the kind of beautiful that made you forget to breathe, all pale skin and dark hair, and lips the color of fresh blood. Her dress probably cost more than I made in a year, and she wore it with the unconscious grace of someone who'd never questioned whether she deserved beautiful things. She slid into the booth across from Elias with a smile that never reached her eyes. They spoke in English, polite and formal, discussing their upcoming nuptials with all the passion of business partners negotiating a merger, which, I would later learn, was exactly what it was. I served them throughout the evening, refilling glasses and bringing small plates of delicacies that I tried not to think too hard about. And I watched. I've always been a watcher. It's a skill you develop when you grow up knowing that the shadows have teeth. I watched the way Elias's jaw tightened whenever Lilith touched his hand. I watched the way his eyes drifted to the window, to the night beyond, like a prisoner counting the days of his sentence. I watched the way Lilith's smile turned sharp whenever someone else drew Elias's attention, possessive and cold. But mostly, I watched the way Elias looked at me when he thought no one else was paying attention. There was something in his gaze that I couldn't quite name. Curiosity, perhaps, or maybe recognition. As if he saw something in me that surprised him. He started coming back every night, always the same booth, always the same order, always alone, at least at first. He would sit for hours, reading leather-bound books in languages I couldn't identify, occasionally lifting his eyes to watch the other patrons with an expression somewhere between boredom and melancholy. I learned his preferences quickly. He liked his blood wine warm but not hot, served in the cut crystal goblet, never the regular glasses. He preferred the ambient lighting low. He tipped exactly 30%, never more, never less, with a precision that spoke of centuries of unchanging habit. We didn't speak much at first beyond the necessary pleasantries of server and patron, but there was something building between us, subtle as fog creeping in from the sea. I felt it in the way his eyes would find mine across the room, in the way he always seemed to time his visits to my shifts, in the moments of silence that felt less like absence and more like anticipation. 3 weeks after I first met him, Lilith started joining him for what she called their family dinners. These weren't the intimate affairs of engaged couples planning their future. These were formal gatherings with her parents, Lord and Lady Vorienne, ancient vampires whose blood was so pure they claimed direct lineage to the first turned. That's when I first heard old Lyson spoken aloud. It happened during one of those interminable dinners. I was refilling Lord Vorien's glass, when he leaned toward his wife and murmured something in a language that made my blood run cold with recognition. The words rolled off his tongue like smoke and gravel, ancient and dangerous and achingly familiar. My grandmother's phonetic transcriptions had been crude approximations, but they were enough. Enough for me to catch fragments. Enough to understand. Enough to realize that they were speaking about Elias like he wasn't even there. They discussed him the way you might discuss a prize stallion or a particularly valuable piece of art. His bloodline, his properties, his usefulness. Lady Vorienne mentioned something about ancient contracts and binding ceremonies. Lord Vorienne laughed, a sound like grinding bones, and said something that made my blood freeze. The word translated roughly to thrall, a vampire enslaved to another vampire's will, stripped of autonomy, reduced to little more than a puppet dancing on strings of blood and ancient magic. I looked at Elias then, and saw something that broke my heart. He sat perfectly still, his expression carefully neutral, his hands folded on the table in front of him, but his eyes held a desperate, caged thing that I recognized all too well. He didn't understand what they were saying. He had no idea that his engagement was a trap, that his wedding would be a shackling, that Lilith and her family were planning to strip away everything that made him himself. I almost dropped the wine carafe. The next evening he came alone again. I brought him his usual order, but this time my hands were shaking. I set the goblet down with more force than I intended, and a drop of blood wine splashed onto the white tablecloth like a crimson accusation. He looked up at me with those smoke-colored eyes and asked if I was all right. His voice held genuine concern, which somehow made everything worse. Here was a centuries-old vampire, powerful enough to tear me apart without breaking stride, asking after my welfare like I was the one in danger. I should have walked away. I should have kept my mouth shut, served my tables, collected my tips, and gone home to my studio apartment and my normal, safe, mortal life. Instead, I leaned down and whispered 8 words that would change both of our lives forever. "They're speaking about you. You should understand what they're saying." His eyes widened fractionally. It was the first unguarded expression I'd ever seen on his face. Surprise, confusion, and underneath it all, a spark of something that might have been hope. He asked me what I meant. I told him I couldn't explain there, not in the middle of the dining room where anyone might overhear. But I gave him an address, an old church in the ruins beneath the Gothic quarter, long abandoned, where the ceiling had collapsed and the moon could shine through. I told him to come at midnight if he wanted answers, if he wanted the truth, if he wanted to save himself. Then I walked away before my courage could fail, my heart hammering against my ribs like it was trying to escape my chest. What had I just done? He came. Part of me hadn't believed he would. Part of me had hoped he wouldn't. But as midnight struck and I sat alone in that ruined church, watching moonlight pour through the broken ceiling like liquid silver, I heard his footsteps on the stone floor. Elias Draven materialized from the shadows like he'd been born from them. In the moonlight, he looked even more otherworldly, his features too perfect to be entirely human, his movements too fluid to belong to anything with a heartbeat. He asked me who I was, really, truly, who I was, and so I told him. I told him about my grandmother, the hunter, about her journals filled with phonetic old Lyson and sketches of vampiric sigils, about the night she died, and the promise my mother made me swear, to never follow in her footsteps, to never hunt the hunters, to live a normal, safe, mortal life. I told him how I'd broken that promise in every way that mattered, how I'd studied the old texts in secret, learning the languages and customs of the immortal, how I'd taken the job at the Crimson deliberately, drawn to the danger like a moth to flame, how I'd learned old Lysan from my grandmother's notes, teaching myself to understand the tongue of the ancient bloodlines. He listened without interruption, his face unreadable in the shadows. When I finished, he asked me the only question that mattered. He asked me what they had said. I took a breath and told him everything. I told him about the plans I'd overheard, spoken in old Lysan with the casual cruelty of those who believe themselves safe from comprehension. I told him that his engagement to Lilith Vorian wasn't a marriage, it was a binding ceremony, that the wine they would serve at his wedding was tainted with sacred hunter's blood, the only substance that could break the will of an ancient vampire. I told him that Lilith's family planned to make him thrall, that they would strip away his autonomy, his will, his very self, until nothing remained but an obedient shell wearing Elias Draven's face. That he would become a trophy, a living testament to their power, forced to love and serve the family that had enslaved him. I told him that the next family dinner, scheduled for the coming full moon, would be his last meal as a free being. When I finished, the silence stretched between us like a chasm. Elias stood perfectly still, and for the first time since I'd met him, I saw genuine emotion break through his careful composure. Rage, grief, betrayal, relief, terror, hope. They flickered across his face like shadows cast by a dying fire. He asked me why I was telling him this, why I was risking myself for a monster, why a mortal girl would throw herself between a vampire and his fate. I told him the truth. I told him that I'd watched him for weeks, seen the weariness in his eyes, the quiet desperation of someone trapped in a life they never chose. I told him that my grandmother had taught me to hunt monsters, but she'd also taught me to recognize them. And whatever Elias Draven might be, whatever he might have done in his 2 centuries of existence, he didn't deserve to have his soul stripped away. No one deserved that. He stared at me for a long moment, and I wondered if I'd made a terrible mistake. If he would kill me for knowing too much. If he would dismiss everything I'd said as the ravings of a delusional mortal. If he would return to Lilith and the Vorians and walk willingly into his own destruction. Instead, he did something I never expected. He asked me to teach him. He explained that he'd been born into the vampire world long after old Lyson had fallen out of common use. That he'd learned French and English and Italian, the languages of power and commerce, but never bothered with the ancient tongue. He'd assumed it was dead, a relic of a bygone age. He'd never imagined it would be the language of his betrayal. He told me that he needed to understand what they were saying, to hear the plans forming around him, to know his enemies' intentions before they could bind him in chains made of blood and ritual. And so, in that ruined church beneath the Gothic quarter, with moonlight painting patterns on the broken floor, I began to teach a vampire the language of his ancestors, We met every night after my shift at the Crimson, always in the ruins, always under the open sky. I think he needed the moon, the reminder of the world beyond the suffocating luxury of his existence, and I needed the space, the sense of sacred ground, as protection against what I was doing. Teaching old Lyson to a vampire was like trying to teach a symphony to someone who'd only ever heard silence. The language was harsh and beautiful, full of consonants that sounded like breaking glass and vowels that sang like wind through canyon walls. Every word carried weight, history, blood. I taught him the basics first: greetings, common phrases, the formal structures of vampiric courtesy. Then we moved to the deeper vocabulary, the words for binding and freedom, for will and surrender, for the intricate dance of power that governed the ancient bloodlines. He was a quick study. 2 centuries of existence had given him perfect recall, and a mind that could parse patterns with inhuman precision. But more than that, he was desperate. He attacked the language with the single-minded focus of someone learning to defuse the bomb strapped to their chest. Between lessons, we talked. I learned things about Elias that the suave, controlled vampire in the Crimson had never revealed. I learned that he'd been turned during the French Revolution, that he'd walked away from his human family rather than watch them age and die while he remained unchanged. I learned that he'd spent decades trying to find meaning in immortality, collecting wealth and art and experiences like they could fill the void where his heartbeat used to be. I learned that he'd agreed to marry Lilith not out of love, but out of exhaustion. Out of the weary hope that maybe a partnership with her family would give his endless existence some structure, some purpose, some point. I learned that he'd forgotten what it felt like to want something. And he learned about me, about the girl who grew up in the shadow of her grandmother's legacy, who'd spent her childhood afraid of the dark until she'd learned to understand it, about my mother's desperate attempts to keep me safe, to shield me from the truth about what lurked in Lesmer's shadows, about the night I'd decided that knowledge was better than ignorance, even if it meant living with fear. He asked me once why I wasn't afraid of him. I told him that fear and understanding weren't mutually exclusive, that I was terrified, actually. Terrified of what he was, what he could do, what might happen if anyone discovered what we were doing. But I was more afraid of living in a world where I'd let someone be enslaved without even trying to stop it. Something shifted between us during those lessons. The careful distance we'd maintained began to erode, worn away by proximity and shared purpose, and the strange intimacy of teacher and student. I found myself looking forward to our midnight meetings with an anticipation that had nothing to do with linguistics, and everything to do with the way he looked at me when I explained a particularly complex grammatical structure. I found myself noticing the way moonlight caught in his dark hair, the way his smile, when it appeared, transformed his entire face, the way his voice softened when he practiced the old Lyson words for gratitude and friendship and hope. And I found myself wondering what it would be like to kiss someone who'd last tasted life 200 years ago. 4 weeks before the scheduled wedding, Elias's comprehension of old Lyson reached the point where he could follow complex conversations. We tested it one night, with me reading passages from my grandmother's journals while he translated them back to me in English. He made fewer and fewer mistakes, catching nuances that even I sometimes missed. He was ready. The next family dinner was scheduled for the following full moon. I told him to be careful, to give no sign that he understood what they were saying, to listen, to learn, to gather what information he could before making any move. I told him to survive. He promised me he would. Then he took my hand, his skin cool and smooth as marble, and told me something in old Lyson that made my breath catch. He told me that I'd saved him, that he'd spent 2 centuries existing without living, and in 4 weeks a mortal girl had reminded him what it meant to want to survive. I wanted to tell him that he'd saved me too, that teaching him had given me a purpose beyond hiding from my heritage, that our midnight lessons had become the best part of my day, that somewhere along the way, I'd stopped seeing a vampire and started seeing just Elias. But I didn't say any of that. Instead, I squeezed his hand and told him I'd see him at the Crimson. I didn't know it would be the last normal conversation we'd ever have. The full moon rose over Leismere like a pearl dropped in blood. I felt its pull as I walked to work that evening, felt the way the air grew thick with anticipation and power. Something old stirred in the city's bones, awakened by the lunar cycle and the approach of ancient rituals. The Crimson was packed that night. Every table filled with immortals dressed in their finest, their eyes glittering with predatory excitement. The air hummed with old Lyson, with whispered conversations in a language most humans would never understand. I caught fragments as I moved through the dining room. Plans, deals, dark arrangements sealed over glasses of blood wine. Elias arrived precisely at 9, as always. But tonight, Lilith was on his arm, radiant in a dress the color of fresh wounds. Behind them came Lord and Lady Vorienne, moving through the restaurant like frost creeping across glass. Other vampires bowed their heads as they passed, acknowledgement of power and blood. They took their usual table. I approached with my practiced smile, though my hands were shaking so badly I had to clasp them behind my back. Elias's eyes met mine for just a moment, and I saw the tension coiled beneath his careful composure. Lord Vorienne ordered for the table in Old Lyson, his voice carrying the weight of centuries. He requested their finest blood wine, the reserve vintage, and specific crystal goblets from the private collection. His words were courteous, but I caught the edge of anticipation beneath them. This was it, the beginning of their plan. I retreated to the bar, my heart hammering. I'd spent weeks preparing Elias for this moment, but now that it had arrived, I felt sick with dread. What if he made a mistake? What if they caught him understanding? What if everything we'd done only made things worse? The sommelier prepared their order with ritualistic precision. 4 goblets of blood wine, aged to perfection. But I watched as he added something extra to one of them. A small vial of liquid that caught the light like liquid mercury. He handled it with reverence and fear, the mark of sacred hunter's blood. The goblet meant for Elias. I carried the tray back to their table with my stomach in knots. Protocol demanded I serve from right to left, which meant Lady Vorienne first, then Lord Vorienne, then Lilith, and finally Elias. Each goblet perfectly placed, the tainted one saved for last. As I set down the final glass, my hand wavered. Just a fraction of a second, barely noticeable. But Elias noticed. His eyes flickered to mine, a question forming. I wanted to scream, to knock the goblet from the table, to grab his hand and run. Instead, I stepped back and clasped my hands behind my back, the very picture of professional service. Lord Vorienne raised his goblet and spoke in Old Lysan. He proposed a toast to eternal bonds and unbreakable vows, to family and blood and the preservation of ancient power. His words were honey-sweet and sharp as knives, full of double meanings that Elias would have missed a month ago. But not anymore. I saw the moment of realization in Elias's eyes, saw him understand the full scope of their treachery, laid out in poetic Old Lysan while they assumed he remained ignorant. Lady Vorienne added her own blessing, speaking of binding and surrender with a smile that promised cruelty. Lilith laughed, a sound like breaking glass, and made a comment about how tractable Elias would become. They were toasting his enslavement, celebrating it, savoring the anticipation of breaking him. Elias lifted his goblet. For a moment that stretched into eternity, I thought he would drink, that he would go through with it anyway, resigned to his fate, accepting the inevitable. Then he spoke. In perfect, flawless Old Lysan, his accent carrying the weight of ancient bloodlines, he said, "To the eternal bonds of the foolish and the breaking of unearned vows, to the end of pretty lies and the beginning of truth." The silence that followed was absolute. Every vampire in the Crimson turned to stare. Lord Vorienne's face went from confident to confused to absolutely furious in the span of a heartbeat. Lady Vorienne hissed, a sound that raised the hair on the back of my neck. Lilith's beautiful face twisted into something ugly and terrible. Elias smiled. It was the first genuine smile I'd ever seen on his face, all teeth and defiance, and 2 centuries of suppressed rage finally given voice. He continued speaking in Old Lysan, his words cutting through the shocked silence like a blade through silk. He told them he knew about the hunter's blood in his wine. He knew about their plan to bind him. He knew every treacherous detail they'd discussed while believing themselves safe in their ancient tongue. He told them the engagement was over. Then he looked directly at me and switched to English. He told me to run. Everything happened at once. Lord Vorian lunged across the table, moving with inhuman speed. Elias met him halfway, the two of them colliding in a blur of motion that sent the table crashing sideways. Crystal shattered. Blood wine sprayed across white tablecloths like murder. I ran. I'd like to say I ran to help Elias, to fight beside him, to be brave. But the truth is I ran because I was terrified. Because I was a mortal in a room full of predators who just had their careful plans destroyed. Because Elias had told me to run, and every instinct I possessed was screaming that staying would mean death. I made it to the kitchen before Lilith caught me. She appeared in front of me without warning, moving so fast she seemed to teleport. One moment the path ahead was clear, the next she was there, her face a mask of rage and something worse, humiliation. She grabbed me by the throat and lifted me off my feet with one hand. Her fingers were iron, cold and immovable. I clawed at her wrist uselessly, my vision already starting to gray at the edges. She asked me in Old Lysan how I'd done it, how a mortal girl had learned the ancient tongue, how I'd managed to teach it to Elias, how I'd dared to interfere in affairs so far above my station that I couldn't even comprehend the consequences. I couldn't have answered even if I'd wanted to. My lungs burned. My throat felt like it was collapsing. Darkness crept in from the edges of my vision. Then Elias was there. He moved like violence given form, like wrath sculpted from shadow. He tore Lilith away from me with a force that sent her crashing through the kitchen wall. I collapsed to the floor, gasping, my throat screaming in pain. Through watering eyes, I watched them fight. It wasn't like the movies, wasn't choreographed or elegant. It was brutal and fast and terrifying. They were blurs of motion, too quick for my mortal eyes to fully follow. I caught glimpses. Elias's face contorted in rage. Lilith's claws raking across his chest, both of them moving with a violence that shook the building. Elias won, not because he was stronger, but because he had something Lilith didn't. He had a reason to fight beyond pride or power. He had something worth surviving for. He pinned her against the rubble of the broken wall, one hand around her throat, the other holding a jagged piece of broken table leg like a stake. For a moment, I thought he would kill her, thought he would drive that makeshift stake through her heart and end it. Instead, he spoke to her in Old Lysan, told her that he was done being anyone's possession, that he rejected the Vorian family and all their schemes, that if she or her parents came for him again, he wouldn't be merciful a second time. Then he let her go. Lilith fled, moving with desperate speed. Elias stood in the wreckage of the kitchen, his chest heaving with unnecessary breath, blood, his own or others, staining his clothes. He looked like a warrior from an ancient myth, beautiful and terrible and absolutely lethal. Then he turned to me, and the violence bled out of him like air from a punctured tire. He knelt beside me, his hands gentle as he checked my throat, his eyes full of concern and guilt, and something I was afraid to name. He asked me if I was all right. His voice was rough, shaken in a way I'd never heard before. I wanted to laugh, to tell him that I'd just watched vampires try to enslave each other in the middle of a restaurant, that I'd been strangled by an immortal socialite, that nothing about this situation was all right. Instead, I told him the truth. I told him I was alive, which was more than I'd expected 30 seconds ago. He helped me to my feet, one arm supporting me as the world spun. Through the kitchen door, I could hear chaos, sirens approaching, voices shouting, the sound of the supernatural community realizing that their secrets had been explosively revealed. Elias told me we needed to leave, that the Vorians wouldn't give up easily, that they had power and influence and enough ancient allies to make both our lives impossible, that staying in Lismere meant looking over our shoulders forever, waiting for revenge. I asked him where we would go. He smiled, that genuine, transformative smile that I'd come to treasure, and told me he knew a place, an old property in the countryside, far from the city and its politics, a place where we could be safe, where he could be free. Then he asked me something that stopped my heart. He asked me if I would come with him. I should have said no, should have gone back to my studio apartment and my normal life, should have taken my mother's advice and stayed far, far away from the darkness. But standing there in the wreckage of the Crimson, with Elias's cool hand in mine and the night stretching out before us full of terrible possibility, I realized something. I'd spent my whole life trying to understand the darkness. Maybe it was time to walk into it willingly, hand in hand with someone who'd learned to appreciate the light. I told him yes. The estate Elias had mentioned turned out to be a crumbling manor house 3 hours outside Lismere, surrounded by acres of overgrown forest. It had belonged to his family before his turning, abandoned for nearly 2 centuries. The roof leaked in places, the windows were broken, and something had made a nest in what used to be the library. It was perfect. We spent our first week just making it livable. Elias had money. 2 centuries of compound interest had seen to that. And he used it to hire contractors who didn't ask questions. They fixed the roof, replaced the windows, cleared out the wildlife. Slowly, the manor began to resemble a home rather than a tomb. I should have been terrified. I was living with a vampire miles from civilization, completely dependent on his goodwill. Every survival instinct my grandmother had instilled in me screamed that this was dangerous, reckless, insane. But here's what the old hunter's manuals never told you. Monsters are only terrifying until you know them. Until you've seen them struggle with modern coffee makers at 3 in the morning. Until you've watched them try to navigate streaming services with the frustrated confusion of someone who remembers when entertainment meant live theater. Until you've seen them smile in genuine happiness for the first time in centuries. Elias taught me things about the immortal world that my grandmother's journals had never covered. He told me about the politics of vampire society, about bloodlines and territories and the intricate web of alliances that governed their kind. He explained why the Vorians had wanted to bind him. His bloodline was one of the oldest, and his independence threatened their carefully maintained power structure. He told me that breaking an engagement in vampire society wasn't just a social faux pas. It was a declaration of war. But for the first time in his long existence, he told me, he didn't care about vampire politics or ancient protocols. He'd spent 200 years playing by rules he never agreed to, trying to find meaning in a system designed to reduce individuals to pawns. He was done with all of it. In return, I taught him about mortal life, real mortal life, not the sanitized version he'd observed from a distance. I taught him about streaming services and social media, about modern music and contemporary literature. I dragged him on grocery shopping trips and made him try foods he'd never bothered tasting in 2 centuries. I taught him how to live, not just exist. The intimacy between us deepened like water wearing away stone, slowly at first, then all at once. It started with small touches, his hand steadying me as I climbed a ladder to reach a high shelf, my fingers brushing his as we passed tools back and forth during renovations. The way we'd unconsciously moved into each other's space, comfort overriding the careful distance we'd maintained in the city. 2 months after fleeing Lismere, I kissed him. It happened in the library we'd finally finished clearing out. I'd found a collection of books in Old Lyson, original texts from before the diaspora. I'd called Elias over to translate, both of us leaning over the ancient pages, our heads close together. He'd been reading aloud, his voice wrapping around the ancient words like they'd been made for him. I'd looked up at him, at the concentration on his face, at the way the lamplight cast shadows that made him look even more otherworldly. And I'd realized I was completely, catastrophically in love with him. So I'd leaned forward and pressed my lips to his. For a moment, he'd frozen, completely still. Then he'd kissed me back with a gentleness that made my heart ache. His lips were cool but not cold, and he kissed like someone relearning a language they thought they'd forgotten. When we finally broke apart, he'd looked at me with wonder and fear and something that might have been joy. He'd told me in Old Lyson, because some things are too important for modern languages, that he'd forgotten what it felt like to want something beyond survival, that I'd reminded him what it meant to hope. I told him in the same ancient tongue that he'd taught me it was okay to want more than existence, that survival wasn't enough when life itself was possible. We'd made love that night for the first time, and it was nothing like the stories. There was awkwardness. 2 centuries of practice didn't prepare you for actual intimacy. There was laughter when we bumped heads trying to navigate the ancient couch. There was tenderness as Elias relearned how to be gentle with something precious. And there was love. Real, transformative love between a mortal and a monster, between a hunter's granddaughter and the creature she was supposed to fear. But happiness in stories never lasts, especially not in stories about vampires and the mortals foolish enough to love them. 3 months into our sanctuary, my mother called. I'd avoided contacting her since leaving Lismere, knowing she'd try to talk me out of everything I'd done. But she'd tracked me down somehow. Mothers have their ways. She told me my grandmother's sister had died. My great-aunt Helena, the last living hunter in our family line. She'd left everything to me in her will, her house, her books, her weapons, and she'd left a message. My mother's voice broke as she read it. For Seraphine, who inherited the sight even though we tried to blind her to it. May she find the strength to see monsters for what they truly are, and the wisdom to know when she's become one herself. The words hit me like a physical blow. What was I doing? I'd abandoned my life, my family, my humanity to run away with a vampire. I'd traded everything I'd known for love. But what if love wasn't enough? What if my great-aunt was right? What if I'd already crossed a line I could never uncross? Elias found me crying in the study after I hung up. He didn't ask what was wrong. He just held me, his arms cool and strong around my shaking shoulders. And I realized something that made me cry harder. I realized I didn't regret anything. Not saving him, not teaching him, not running away with him, not falling in love with him. If becoming a monster meant choosing love over fear, then maybe monsters weren't so terrible after all. I told Elias about my great-aunt's message, about the legacy of hunting that ran in my blood, about the expectations I'd been born into and spent my whole life trying to reconcile. I told him that everyone expected me to see him as a monster, to fear him, to eventually destroy him. I told him I couldn't do any of those things because I loved him. He held me tighter and told me something that changed everything. He told me that he'd spent 2 centuries believing he was a monster, that he'd accepted it, internalized it, built his entire existence around the assumption that he was fundamentally wrong, fundamentally broken, fundamentally other. Then he'd met me, a mortal girl who looked at him and saw not a monster but a person, who taught him and laughed with him and kissed him like he was worthy of tenderness. Who chose him when she could have chosen safety? He told me that I'd given him something more precious than freedom. I'd given him the possibility of redemption. We sat together in the study that night, holding each other as the moon rose over the forest, and I understood something my grandmother and great-aunt never had. The world wasn't divided into monsters and humans. It was divided into those who chose love and those who chose fear, and I chose love. 6 months after leaving Lismere, word reached us that Lilith Vorien had married someone else, another vampire, from another old bloodline, in a ceremony that everyone agreed was lovely, even if the bride seemed somewhat diminished. The vampire grapevine, because of course such a thing existed, reported that Lilith's humiliation at the Crimson had destroyed her standing in society. Her parents had lost face. Their plans for consolidating power had crumbled. They'd been forced to settle for lesser alliances, reduced circumstances. Elias felt nothing when he heard the news. No triumph, no satisfaction, no vindication. He'd moved beyond caring about vampire politics and social standing. He'd found something better than power. He'd found peace. We built a life in that crumbling manner. Not a vampire's life or a human's life, but something in between. Something uniquely ours. Elias learned to appreciate mortal pleasures. Good food, even if he couldn't eat it. Music that hadn't existed in his youth. The simple joy of watching sunrise through windows he'd once feared. I learned to navigate the immortal world, not as a hunter or a victim, but as a partner. Elias taught me vampire politics and history, ancient rituals and forgotten customs. Together, we became something neither of our worlds had anticipated. A bridge between mortal and immortal, human and vampire, fear and love. On the 1-year anniversary of the night we met, Elias proposed, not in Old Lysan or English, but in a language we'd created together, a mix of ancient vampire traditions and modern human customs. A language that belonged only to us. He asked me if I would bind my mortal life to his immortal one, knowing the pain that would come, knowing that I would age while he remained unchanged, knowing that eventually, inevitably, death would separate us. He asked me if decades of love were worth the eternity of loss that would follow. I told him yes, without hesitation, because love isn't measured in eternities, it's measured in moments, in midnight lessons and shared laughter and the way he looked at me like I'd hung the moon, in choosing each other every single day, knowing that someday those days would end. We married in the ruins where he'd first asked me to teach him Old Lysan. Just the two of us, under the open sky, with the moon as our witness. No vampire ceremony with its blood rituals and binding vows. No human wedding with its crowds and expectations. Just us, speaking our promises in the language we'd created, sealing them with a kiss that tasted of forever, even though we both knew better. My mother came to visit 3 months after the wedding. She'd finally tracked down our location, though I suspected Elias had made it easier than it could have been. She arrived with holy water in her purse and a stake in her luggage, prepared to save her daughter from the monster who'd stolen her. She found us in the garden, Elias reading aloud from a novel while I planted herbs in the late afternoon sun. She watched us for a long moment, this portrait of domestic tranquility that made no sense according to everything she believed about vampires. Then she put down her weapons and asked to join us for tea. Over the following weeks, my mother learned what I'd discovered, that Elias wasn't a monster wearing a human face, but a person who'd been trapped in a monstrous existence. She saw the way he looked at me, the way he cherished every moment of my mortal life like it was sacred. She heard him speak about the loneliness of immortality, about the hollow years before I'd taught him to hope again. She didn't forgive him for being what he was, but she accepted him for who he'd become. And sometimes, that was enough. Years passed. I grew older while Elias remained frozen in his eternal youth. My hair began to gray. Lines appeared at the corners of my eyes. My body slowed, aged, changed in all the ways mortal bodies do. Elias loved every change. He catalogued each new wrinkle like it was a treasure, kissed the gray in my hair with reverence, held my aging hands like they were more precious than any ancient artifact. He told me I was more beautiful at 45 than I'd been at 23, because now every line told a story, and every story was about choosing each other. We knew what was coming, the end that waits for every mortal, the separation that immortality makes inevitable. We talked about it sometimes, late at night when the weight of the future pressed too heavily. Elias asked me once if I regretted choosing a love that would end. I told him that all love ends, whether in decades or centuries, whether through death or distance or the slow erosion of time. Every love story reaches its final chapter. The only question was whether the story was worth telling. Ours was. Ours absolutely was. I'm 63 now. My body aches in ways it never used to, and stairs have become negotiable obstacles rather than afterthoughts. But I wake up every morning to Elias's face, unchanged and unchanging, and I feel nothing but gratitude. Gratitude for every day we've had, for every lesson in the ruins, every kiss in the manor, every moment of choosing love over fear. Gratitude for the way he looks at me like I'm still that young server who dared to whisper warnings to a vampire she barely knew. Gratitude for being loved so completely by someone who will have to carry that love long after I'm gone. Sometimes, late at night, Elias still asks me to teach him Old Lysan phrases he's forgotten. It's become our ritual, our way of connecting across the years. I'll speak the ancient words, my voice raspier than it used to be but still strong, and he'll repeat them back with perfect pronunciation, and we'll remember the night we met. The night a vampire learned to hope and a hunter's granddaughter learned to love. The night that changed everything. People ask me sometimes, in those rare moments when I venture into town, if I'm afraid of dying. If I regret binding my brief mortal life to someone who will outlive me by centuries. I tell them the truth. I tell them that I've lived more in 4 decades with Elias than most people live in twice that time. That I've loved and been loved with an intensity that most humans never experience. That I've walked between worlds and found beauty in shadows and learned that redemption is always possible. I tell them that when my time comes, I'll die knowing I saved not just a vampire, but a soul. That I helped someone trapped in darkness find their way back to the light. That I chose love when fear would have been easier. And that choice made all the difference. And I'll die knowing that somewhere, in the centuries after I'm gone, Elias will carry our story forward. He'll remember the mortal girl who taught him old Lysan in ruined churches. He'll remember the way she smiled when he butchered the pronunciation. He'll remember that love, even temporary love, even doomed love, is worth the pain that comes after. They say immortals don't dream. The centuries of existence hollow out the capacity for wonder, leaving only hunger and habit in their wake. But I've watched Elias dream. I've seen him wake with my name on his lips and wonder in his eyes. I've watched him plan futures and celebrate presents and cherish each moment like it's the only one that matters. I taught a vampire to dream, and in return, he taught me that love isn't measured in eternities. It's measured in the courage to choose it anyway, knowing it will end. In the willingness to bind your heart to someone else's, even when that someone exists outside the normal flow of time. This is our story, the story of the Crimson, of blood and betrayal, of ancient tongues and deadly secrets, the story of how a mortal and a monster built something beautiful from broken pieces. This is the story of redemption, and it begins with 8 simple words. They're speaking about you. You should understand what they're saying. I write these words on my 65th birthday, knowing that my time grows shorter with each passing season. My hands shake as I hold the pen, the arthritis that settled into my joints making every letter a small victory. But these words need to be written. This story needs to be told. Not for me. I've lived it, breathed it, built my entire adult life around it. But for Elias is who will carry it forward when I'm gone. For my mother, who finally understood that love transcends the boundaries we build around it. For every person who's ever stood at the edge of darkness and wondered if stepping into it might be the bravest thing they ever do. Elias found me this morning in our study, surrounded by these pages, tears tracking down my weathered cheeks. He knelt beside my chair. He always kneels now, bringing himself to my level rather than towering over my diminished frame, and asked what troubled me. I told him I wasn't troubled. I was remembering the night we met, the weight of the crystal goblet in my hands, the moment I decided to save him, remembering our lessons in the ruins, the way he struggled with old Lysan pronunciation until suddenly he didn't, remembering our first kiss, our wedding, every perfect, imperfect moment in between. He took my hand, his cool, eternal, unchanged, and told me in old Lysan that remembering wasn't the same as mourning, that our story wasn't over yet, that every moment we still had was a gift worth celebrating. He was right. He's always right about these things. So I'm celebrating. I'm celebrating every word I write, every memory I preserve, every moment I steal from the inevitable. I'm celebrating the fact that I, Seraphine Thorne, former server at the Crimson and granddaughter of hunters, chose to love a vampire and never regretted it for a single day. I'm celebrating the fact that love, real love, changes everything it touches, that it transformed Elias from a weary immortal marking time into someone who cherishes every sunset he can't see and every sunrise he experiences through my eyes, that it transformed me from a girl hiding from her heritage into a woman who embraced both darkness and light. Most importantly, I'm celebrating the fact that our story, this impossible, beautiful, temporary story, proved something the hunters and vampires alike never believed possible. It proved that redemption is real, that monsters can become men, that mortal love can heal immortal wounds, that choosing each other every single day is its own form of magic. Elias sits beside me now as I write these final words. The study is quiet, except for the scratch of my pen and the sound of his breath, unnecessary but habitual, a remnant of humanity he maintains because it comforts me. Outside, the sun is setting over the forest that surrounds our manor, painting the sky in shades of crimson. Crimson, the color of blood and wine, of violence and passion, of endings and beginnings, the color of the crimson where our story began, the color of the vow we made to each other, to love completely even though loss was guaranteed. Elias tells me the sunset is beautiful. He's learned to appreciate them through my descriptions, through my wonder, through the way my face lights up at the colors I still never tire of seeing. He tells me he's grateful for every sunset we've watched together, every twilight moment stolen from time. I tell him I'm grateful too. Grateful for him, for us, for every impossible moment that brought us here. Grateful for the chance to live a love story that everyone said was doomed, but no one could deny was real. They say that immortals don't dream, that centuries of existence hollow out the capacity for wonder, leaving only hunger and habit in their wake. But I know better. I've spent 4 decades watching an immortal dream, watching him wake each evening with renewed purpose, watching him find wonder in the smallest moments, a new book, a perfect cup of coffee that he can't drink but loves to smell, the way moonlight catches in my silver hair. I've watched him live, not just exist, and that, more than anything, is the greatest victory of all. My hand is cramping now, my aging body demanding rest. But before I set down this pen, before I close this chapter of our story, I want to say one final thing. To everyone who reads these words, whether in my lifetime or centuries after, don't be afraid to love the impossible. Don't let fear keep you from choosing connection over safety, from choosing someone who exists outside your understanding of normal. Don't let the certainty of ending prevent you from embracing the beauty of beginning. Love isn't measured in eternities. It's measured in moments, in whispered lessons and shared silences, in choosing each other when the world says you shouldn't, in building something beautiful, knowing it can't last forever. Because here's what I've learned in my 65 years, 40 of them spent loving a vampire. Nothing lasts forever. Not life, not youth, not even immortality. Because what's the point of living forever if you're not truly alive? But love, real love, transcends time itself. It lives in memories and stories, in the way we change each other, in the marks we leave on each other's souls. Elias will carry our love forward long after I'm gone. He'll remember every moment, hold every memory close, and live the life we built together even when I'm no longer here to share it. And in that way, through him, our love becomes something close to immortal after all. That's the real magic, not in ancient rituals or vampiric powers or hunters' legacies, but in the simple, profound act of loving someone so completely that you transform them, that you give them reasons to dream, to hope, to live. This is our story, the crimson vow we made to each other in ruins and gardens, in darkness and light, in the space between mortal and immortal where true magic lives. This is the story of Seraphine Thorn, who taught a vampire to speak the language of his ancestors, and, in doing so, taught him to speak the language of his own heart. This is the story of Elias Draven, who learned that redemption isn't found in the light. It's forged in the courage to step into darkness with someone you trust. This is our story, and it was worth every moment.